She thought it was just junk, piles of tools, dust, and hay. But when she pulled that old tarp off the back corner, she froze. There was a wooden box with her father's name carved on it, and a note taped to the top that said, "For my daughter, when she's ready to know who I really was." What she found inside didn't just change how she saw him, it changed her life. Before I dive into this incredible and heartbreaking story, please take a moment and subscribe to our channel so we can bring even more powerful stories like these. The day they buried her father, the sky felt heavier than usual. Thick gray clouds rolled over the quiet Mississippi town like they were carrying the weight of memories nobody wanted to name out loud. Claire Thompson stood under a black umbrella, her fingers curled tight around the handle, knuckles pale from the cold and from trying not to fall apart. She was 36 now, a school teacher in Atlanta, polished and composed, at least on the outside. But grief had a way of peeling people down to their softest parts. Around her, maybe 15 people gathered. Old neighbors, church friends, distant relatives who whispered the same things she'd heard her whole life. William Thompson, good man, hard-working man, but quiet, kept to himself, stubborn as a mule. They said the same lines like they were reading from a script. Claire lowered her gaze to the casket, swallowed the lump in her throat, and wondered, not for the first time, if anyone here really knew her father. She certainly didn't. Not fully. Not beyond the surface-level memories of a man who fixed tractors and fences, who smelled of earth and hay and diesel, who didn't talk much unless you asked him a direct question. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't warm. He was just there. Always there. A steady, silent fixture in a house that had always felt too big and too quiet. When the service ended and people drifted away in slow, murmuring groups, her Aunt Deborah wrapped a sturdy arm around Claire's shoulders. Deborah was a woman built like a barn beam, strong, wide-shouldered, and always honest to a fault. "You all right, baby?" she asked in a low voice. Claire nodded, but her eyes burned. "I should have visited more. I should have—" "Don't go blaming yourself," Deborah cut in firmly. "Your daddy wouldn't want that. That man lived on his own terms. You know that." Claire looked out across the cemetery, a gentle slope dotted with wildflowers and faded headstones. "Yeah, I know." But the guilt sank deeper anyway. After the funeral, they drove back to the old family farm. 50 acres of aging land, the kind that used to feed 3 generations, but now barely held anything except weeds and memories. The house stood at the edge of the property, its white paint peeling, porch steps sagging, wind chimes clicking softly in the breeze. Inside, everything smelled like him. Wood smoke, old coffee, motor oil. It hit her hard. Too hard. She stepped inside and froze, overwhelmed by the silence he'd left behind. Deborah walked ahead, clicking the kitchen light on. "He didn't keep much," she said, rifling through a stack of bills and receipts. "Left most things simple. But that barn—" Claire lifted her head. "What about it?" Deborah snorted softly. "Your daddy locked that place up like it held ghosts. Never let nobody in. Not even me." She shrugged. "Always figured it was just old tools and junk. Man was private. Too private sometimes." Claire pressed her lips together. She remembered that barn, the worn red paint, the heavy sliding door, the way her father always kept the key on him. She could picture him standing in front of it, broad shoulders blocking the door, as if protecting something fragile. "Why'd he keep it locked?" Claire asked quietly. Deborah's expression softened. Some folks carry things they don't talk about. Regrets, secrets. Your daddy had that look sometimes. She exhaled a long sigh, like he was scared the past might climb back out if he didn't keep the door shut. Claire felt a shiver crawl across her back. Later that evening, after Deborah left and the house settled into a deep, empty quiet, Claire sat at the old kitchen table, staring at the mess of paperwork she needed to sort. Deeds, bank statements, bills. But her attention kept drifting toward the window, toward the silhouette of the barn, standing like a silent sentinel in the fading dusk. Her father had spent 50 years guarding that place. 50 years keeping everyone out. 50 years letting secrets settle into the beams and floorboards. What was he hiding? She pushed back her chair, stood, and walked to the hall closet, the one where his coats still hung. The familiar smell drifted out. Worn denim, pine sawdust, a faint hint of tobacco. Her fingers brushed along the pockets of his old work jacket, stiff and faded from years in the sun. Inside the left pocket, her hand closed around something cold. A key, old, heavy, bronze. She stared at it in her palm, her heartbeat rising slowly, steadily. Maybe this was why she came home. Not just for the funeral, not just for the loose ends, but for the truth. Whatever it was, whatever he left behind. She grabbed the flashlight, pulled on her boots, and stepped outside. The grass was damp from last night's rain, crickets humming softly in the fields. The barn seemed bigger now that she was walking toward it, towering, unfamiliar, almost alive in the moonlight. When she reached it, she lifted a trembling hand and slid the key into the lock. It turned with a low, rusty click. The barn door groaned as she pushed it open. The smell hit her first. Hay, dust, oil, and something older, something untouched for decades. She stepped inside, her flashlight beam sweeping across boxes stacked high, an old tractor covered in tarp, shelves lined with jars, tools, and decades of forgotten things. Then her light landed on something nailed to a wooden beam, a photograph, old, yellowed, her father, young, maybe in his 20s, standing beside a black man about the same age, both smiling, both proud, both holding tools like they'd just finished building something together. On the back, written in faded pencil, 1968, Me and Elijah. Claire stared, breath catching in her chest. Her father never told her about anyone named Elijah. He never smiled like that in any photo she'd ever seen. And she had never known him to have a black friend in the 60s, not in this town, not back then. Confused, she looked down and noticed something else, a corner of a wooden box sticking out from beneath a pile of old feed sacks. Her pulse quickened. She dragged the sacks aside, revealing a heavy, dust-covered box. Her father's name was carved deep into the top, W. Thompson, and a thick padlock sealed it shut. Next to it lay a sealed envelope, her name written on the front. Her hands shook as she tore it open. One line inside stopped her breath cold. For my daughter, when she's ready to know who I really was. The wind rattled the barn wall as Claire stood frozen, her father's letter trembling between her fingers. The flashlight beam shook, casting jerky shadows across the rafters. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. She read the sentence again, slower this time, letting each word sink like a weight into her chest. For my daughter, when she's ready to know who I really was. A chill crawled down her spine. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. But the key had brought her this far, and the ache in her chest told her there was no turning back now. She took a slow step toward the wooden box, the padlock hanging heavy and uninviting. Her fingers hovered over the latch, but before touching it, her eyes drifted back to the old photograph nailed to the beam. Her father, younger, standing tall and loose-shouldered, smiling like a man who didn't know life could turn hard yet. And the other man beside him, Elijah, according to the scribble on the back, wore the same kind of earnest smile. Their hands were dirty, arms draped over each other like brothers. It didn't make sense. Her father, the quiet, melancholy man she grew up with, had never spoken of a friend like that, never spoken of that year, never spoken much of anything now that she thought about it. She gently lifted the photo off the nail, brushing the dust from it. The edges crumbled slightly in her hands, worn from age and sun. She flipped it over and touched the writing. 1968. A year she'd studied in history books. Protests, marches, riots, assassinations. A time when the world was on fire with change. And her father had always refused to talk about it. She set the photo aside, turning once more to the box. The padlock glinted under the flashlight. She reached into her father's coat pocket again on instinct. Maybe another key? But all she found was an old pocket knife. It wasn't much, but after jamming the blade under the latch, prying with all her strength, and muttering a whispered apology to her father's memory, the padlock snapped open with a tired metallic crack. The lid creaked as she lifted it. The smell hit her first. Old paper, leather, dust, and a faint hint of oil. Inside, neatly arranged despite the age, were bundles of notebooks tied with twine, folded documents, and a metal sheriff's badge resting on top like a confession. Claire felt her stomach twist. Her father, a deputy? She had never heard that. He had never kept this badge in the house, never hung it on the wall, never wore it in any photo. Yet here it was, cold and heavy, engraved with a name she knew too well from whispered local stories. Sheriff Dalton, County Patrol. Her blood ran cold. She had heard about Sheriff Dalton since she was a kid, not from official history, but from the murmurs of the older black residents in town. The kind of whispers spoken only after glancing over shoulders. First, Dalton had been ruthless, cruel, untouchable. A man who believed punishment was a form of ownership. A man who disappeared during the early 70s and was never spoken of again. Claire swallowed hard. Her hand trembled as she picked up the first journal. Her father's handwriting covered the first page. Younger, slanted, determined. She read slowly, the words tightening around her like a noose. August 3rd, 1968. I was young, stupid. Thought a badge meant honor. Thought following orders meant doing good. Turns out all it meant was watching horrors I didn't have the courage to stop. Not yet. Her throat constricted. She flipped the next page. Dalton took us on night rounds again. Said we were looking for agitators. But what he meant was any black man walking alone. Tonight, they heard a man. Bad. His name was Elijah Green. Never met a braver soul. They called him Trouble. He was just a man trying to live. Claire felt her pulse throb in her neck. Elijah Green. The man in the photo. She flipped further, heart beating faster with every line. I can't sleep. I can't look my own daddy in the eye. I joined to keep order, not to be part of this. If this is what the law looks like, I don't want it." Page after page painted a picture Claire never imagined. Her father wasn't quiet because he had nothing to say. He was quiet because he carried things too heavy for words. She finally reached a section with dried water stains. Tears. Maybe. September 17, 1968. They came for Elijah again. Dalton said he was organizing trouble. But really, Elijah was teaching folks to read the voting forms. I knew what was coming. I knew, and I couldn't watch another man bleed. I made my choice. Claire's breath hitched. I helped him run. Him in the barn. Loaded my pickup at midnight, drove through the swamp routes only locals know. Told him I'd never say his name again. Not if it meant keeping him alive. Her hands shook so hard she almost dropped the journal. Her father had saved Elijah's life. But then, why the shame? Why the secrecy? She read the next entry. Dalton knew someone helped him escape. He hunted me for weeks. My badge saved me from a bullet, but not from suspicion. I quit before they could fire me. My silence was the only thing that kept Elijah safe. But the guilt, it don't sleep. Claire closed the journal gently, pressing her hand to the cover like she was holding her father's heart. The barn creaked softly behind her, as though the building itself was breathing out a memory. Her father had been part of darkness and then had broken himself free from it. He had lived the rest of his life carrying the weight of what he'd witnessed, and what he'd finally found the courage to stop. She sat back on her heels, tears sliding down her cheeks. She had always thought he was distant, cold, hard, but in truth, he had been haunted. Haunted by the horrors he couldn't unsee. Haunted by the man he couldn't save earlier. Haunted by the secret he protected for half a century. She reached for the photograph again, her father and Elijah smiling, young and hopeful. A moment frozen before everything went wrong. She touched her thumb to her father's face. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know who you were." Outside, the wind pushed against the barn walls, making them groan. Inside, Claire felt a new weight settle inside her chest. Not fear, not sorrow, but responsibility. Her father didn't hide this from her to protect himself. He hid it to protect the truth. And now that truth was in her hands. She knew then she couldn't leave this in the barn. She had to tell their story. The quiet farmer and the man he saved. The deputy who walked away from injustice. The ghosts he locked away for decades. And the daughter finally brave enough to face them. Claire didn't sleep that night. Even after she left the barn, even after she locked the door and shoved the key deep into her pocket, as if that would stop the memories from slipping out. Her mind wouldn't quiet. The house felt different now, heavier, like her father's spirit lingered in every creak of the floorboards, watching her, waiting to see what she would do with the truth he'd left behind. She sat at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea she barely touched, her father's journals stacked in front of her. She kept running her hand over them, tracing the twine wrapped around each bundle, imagining his fingers doing the same 50 years ago. The thought that he wrote all of this, alone and ashamed, made her chest tighten with something sharp. Regret, grief, love all twisted together. Eventually, she couldn't sit still anymore. She grabbed her flashlight and the journals and went back to the barn. The night air was cool, still carrying the distant scent of rain. The crickets hummed like they were whispering secrets to each other. When she opened the barn door again, the old wood groaned like it remembered her from an hour ago. The flashlight swept across old tools, rusted wheels, mason jars of bolts and nails. Her father's quiet world laid bare. It struck her then. She had spent years thinking he was emotionally distant. But maybe he wasn't distant. Maybe he was burying every part of himself in this barn, so the weight of his past wouldn't spill into her childhood. She knelt in front of the wooden box again, lifting out another journal. Thicker, older, its edges curled like it had survived storms. The first page began abruptly. If Claire ever finds this, I'm sorry. Her breath froze. I'm sorry I wasn't the father you needed. Sorry I didn't talk much. Sorry I kept so much hidden. But silence was the only way to keep trouble from finding you. Her eyes blurred. Dalton didn't forgive betrayal. Not ever. When Elijah escaped, Dalton blamed the traitor among his deputies. I knew he suspected me. I could feel it. The way he stared, the questions he asked, the nights I saw his headlights outside the farmhouse and pretended I didn't. Claire pressed a shaking hand to her mouth. Leaving the badge didn't end his reach. Men like him, their shadow stretches long. For years I stayed quiet, and the more I kept inside me, the quieter I became. She shut the journal, fighting tears. This was not the man she remembered. The quiet, steady farmer who fixed tractors and planted tomatoes. This was someone who survived a war most people never knew existed. A war fought in fields, behind barns, on dirt roads, where there were no cameras, no witnesses, no headlines. Claire wiped her face and reached deeper into the box. Underneath the journals was a stack of photographs wrapped in brittle brown paper. She unfolded them gently and stared in stunned silence. There was Elijah again, laughing with her father, leaning against the same tractor covered in tarp behind her. Another photo showed the two of them repairing the roof of a small house. Another showed them sitting on the back porch steps, drinking bottled sodas like old friends. But mixed between those photos were others, darker ones. Burned homes, shattered church windows, marchers holding signs demanding justice. White men in uniforms watching them with suspicion. Claire's fingers tightened. These weren't just memories. They were evidence of a wound that never healed. She found newspaper clippings too, yellowed articles about missing black workers, unexplained beatings, unrest in neighboring towns. And then, tucked between two faded pages, a note written in steadier handwriting. Elijah and I rebuilt what Dalton destroyed, quietly, slowly, secretly. But a seed planted quiet will grow strong. Claire's vision blurred again. She kept flipping through the documents, her heart pounding faster with every new piece of her father she never knew. At the bottom of the box lay something wrapped in oilcloth. She unfolded it carefully, and her breath caught. It was a letter addressed to her in her father's handwriting. The ink was faded, but the words were sharp enough to cut straight through her. Claire, if you found this, then you're stronger than I ever was. I didn't tell you any of this because I didn't want my past to become your burden. I lived with guilt, but you don't have to. I hid the truth, but you don't have to. I carried shame for things I did, but pride for the things I fixed. Her hands shook. You deserve the full story. I hope one day you can understand the man I tried to become, not the man I used to be. There was a final line, written slower, as if he was sick or tired. If the world ever learns the truth, let it be because of you, not because of guilt, but because of love. Claire closed the letter, pressing it against her chest. She didn't know how long she sat there, kneeling on the cold barn floor with tears dripping onto the dirt. But somewhere in the stillness, a shift happened in her. The grief changed shape, from guilt to understanding. Her father wasn't distant because he didn't care. He was distant because he cared too much and didn't know how to carry the past and be a father at the same time. She wiped her face, stood slowly, and looked around the barn again. This place wasn't full of ghosts. It was full of stories. Her father's, Elijah's, people whose names were never printed in history books. People who survived because two young men in 1968 made a dangerous choice to do the right thing. She gathered the box, the journals, the photo, and the badge, and held them tightly against her chest as she walked out of the barn. The moon lit the path to the house as though guiding her. She closed the barn door softly behind her and locked it again, not out of fear this time, but out of respect. The secrets weren't buried anymore. Now they were hers. And in the quiet night, Claire finally understood something she'd never realized. Her father had spent 50 years repairing broken things, but the one thing he spent his whole life trying to fix was himself. The morning light crept across the kitchen table in soft streaks of gold, warming the wood like it was trying to gently shake Claire awake from the heaviness of the night before. But she didn't wake slowly. She jerked up with a gasp, heart pounding, breath shaky, as if her father's last words had followed her into her dreams and refused to leave. She hadn't slept more than an hour. Her eyes were puffy, her hair still smelling faintly of hay and dust from crawling around the barn. But exhaustion didn't matter. Not today. The journals, the photographs, the sheriff's badge. They were all still sitting on the table where she left them. Proof that everything she discovered wasn't some hallucination of grief. She poured herself a cup of coffee with trembling hands, sat down, and stared at the box again. For a long moment, she simply breathed, listening to the quiet of the old farmhouse. No humming refrigerator, no neighbors, no distant highway. Only the creak of settling wood and the ache inside her chest. Claire closed her eyes, letting the silence settle around her. But her father's voice, or what she imagined his voice would sound like if he were sitting across from her, whispered through the back of her mind. There are things I saw, things I did, but I made it right the only way I knew how. She opened the first journal again, and the truth unfolded like a wound reopening. Her father wrote about the town back then, the tension, the fear, the way Sheriff Dalton used the badge like a weapon instead of a shield. He wrote about young black men pulled off trucks for questioning, about families too scared to complain, about nights when the sound of an engine outside your house meant something was wrong. Claire's breath tightened as she read his words. I thought wearing the uniform meant protecting folks, but the man in charge only protected folks who looked like him. She felt her stomach twist. Then came the page that made her hand clamp over her mouth. The night they beat Elijah. I swear I saw the devil wearing a badge. A tear slid down her cheek, splashing onto the ink. She kept reading. Her father had described the scene in broken sentences. How Elijah had been dragged behind the station. How he tried to stop it. How Dalton told him to man up and learn who's in charge. How Elijah never begged, never cried out, just stared at her father with eyes that asked one question, louder than any scream could. Are you going to let this happen? Claire's breath shook. He didn't save Elijah that night. Not then, not until he could no longer stand the guilt clawing at him. She flipped the page with trembling fingers. I couldn't undo what I saw. but I could make sure it never happened to him again. She kept reading through the next entries. Long nights, secret trips to deliver food to Elijah, while he healed in an old shed behind the farm. Whispered conversations about escape routes. Coded plans written inside tractor manuals, so nobody would suspect a thing. Claire could almost see it. Her father, young and terrified. Elijah, bruised but determined. Two men planning something dangerous under the dim glow of a barn lantern. Then came the entry, dated the night Elijah fled town. I drove him myself, told him to duck down when cars passed, told him not to look back. When we reached the train yard, he hugged me like a brother, said I saved his life. But I didn't. I just returned what I owed him. Claire pressed the journal against her chest. Her father had never spoken of this. Not once. Not in 50 years. But now the stories her aunt had told her about him keeping to himself, staying quiet, carrying a darkness he never talked about, all made terrible, beautiful sense. He wasn't distant for no reason. He wasn't cold for no reason. He wasn't stubborn for no reason. He was protecting a truth that might have gotten them both killed. Claire wiped her eyes, sniffed hard, and reached for the stack of newspapers next. Each clipping felt like a window into the world her father had lived through. Protests, marches, church burnings, missing men whose families never got answers. But the worst one was folded neatly between two journals. A small article titled, "Local Man Escapes. Police Suspect Outside Agitators." Elijah's name wasn't mentioned, but she knew. Her father had helped him disappear so thoroughly that the authorities never found him again. Claire felt something tighten inside her chest, a mix of pride and heartbreak. She lifted the sheriff's badge, holding it up to the morning light. It glinted coldly, the same badge her father had sworn to use for good, but had witnessed being used for evil. She whispered, "You didn't deserve to carry this alone." The room felt too quiet after that, too heavy. She grabbed the box and the journals and walked outside into the morning sun. The barn stood ahead of her, old and weathered, but strong, like her father had been. She walked up to it, placed her hand on the red door, and let out a long, shaky breath. This place wasn't cursed. It was sacred. A sanctuary where a broken man tried to rebuild who he was. She stepped inside again, sunlight spilling through the slats, like warm fingers tracing the dust. She looked around at the shelves, the tools, the jars of bolts and screws. Every item felt like part of him. A man who tried to fix the world with his hands when he couldn't fix his past with words. She whispered into the musty air, "I forgive you." Her voice cracked. "And I'm gonna tell them who you really were." The wind outside shifted, brushing against the barn siding. For a moment, it felt like the building exhaled. Claire took the box into her arms, hugged it to her chest like it was her father himself, and walked firmly out of the barn. The truth had been buried for 50 years. It wasn't staying buried anymore. Claire sat in her truck for almost an hour before she finally turned the key in the ignition. The journals were stacked neatly on the passenger seat. The badge wrapped in a towel, the newspaper clippings tucked carefully inside a folder. She kept glancing over at them, like they might disappear if she blinked too long, like the truth she'd discovered could evaporate if she didn't carry it with both hands. The drive into town felt slower than usual, every mile marker passing with the weight of 50 years pressed beneath it. She felt her father in the air around her, not as a haunting, but as a presence, quiet, steady, guiding, the same way he used to sit beside her in this truck when she was 16, teaching her to drive, pointing out deer tracks, humming low to old radio songs. The world looked the same, but she didn't. Not anymore. When she pulled up to the small brick building that housed the Magnolia County Ledger, she stopped the engine and just sat there. Her heart thudded against her ribs, each beat asking the same question. What if telling the truth ruins everything? Then another voice, steadier, whispered back, what if telling the truth fixes what he couldn't? She gathered the box, the folder, the journals, and walked inside. The bell over the door jingled with an innocence that didn't match the gravity she carried. Inside, a young woman sat behind a cluttered desk, typing so fast her fingers were a blur. A half-finished iced coffee sweated beside her keyboard. The woman looked up. "Can I help you?" Claire swallowed hard. I need to speak with a reporter. It's important." The receptionist blinked, noticing the worn journals in Claire's arms. The way someone might notice a person walking in holding a live grenade. She stood. "Let me get Mr. Jameson." Moments later, a tall man in his late 50s stepped out from an office, adjusting his glasses. The smell of old paper and ink following him like a trail. His expression was polite, but distracted, until he saw what Claire was holding. "Ma'am, come on back." He closed his door behind them, gestured for her to sit, and folded his hands on the desk. "What do you have there?" Claire didn't answer right away. Instead, she placed the journals down one by one, then the folder, then the badge, and finally her father's letter. Jameson looked at the pile, then at her. "Ma'am, where did you get these?" Claire's voice was barely a whisper. "From my father, after he passed." Jameson opened the first journal, and everything changed. His eyes widened as he scanned the pages, his breath catching the moment he reached Elijah Green's name. He flipped through the entries, then to the newspaper clippings taped inside. His face went pale. He whispered, "My God, these are first-hand accounts." Claire nodded. Jameson leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. "Ma'am, do you understand what you're holding?" "I do. That's why I brought them." He picked up the badge next, holding it with the caution of someone touching a cursed artifact. This belonged to Sheriff Dalton's department." "I know," Claire's voice wavered. "My father was a deputy." Jameson stared at her, disbelief melting into realization. "You're William Thompson's girl." Claire nodded again, but this time there was something steadier in her eyes. He wasn't who this town thought he was. Jameson flipped to the entry about Elijah's beating, reading the words out loud in a low, shaken voice. When he finished, he closed the journal gently, like he was afraid it might break in his hands. "I've covered this county for 30 years, he said slowly. "We always heard rumors about missing workers and beatings that never made the paper. Folks talked about Dalton like he was a god, untouchable, and no deputy ever spoke up." Claire swallowed. "My father tried. Maybe not loud enough back then, but he tried." Jameson pressed his palms together, thinking hard. This could rewrite the entire town's history. "I know. It's going to make people angry. I know that too. And some won't believe it." Claire's voice cracked, but she didn't break. "That's fine. I believe it. And Elijah's family deserves to know." The reporter studied her for a long moment, then nodded with a seriousness that felt like a promise. "Okay," he said softly. "Let's tell the truth." For the next 2 hours, Claire sat across from him as he photographed the journals, scanned the clippings, copied the badge, and asked questions that felt like reopening wounds that weren't hers, but somehow lived inside her anyway. When she left the office and stepped onto the sidewalk, she didn't expect anything to happen immediately. But things don't always wait. By the time she reached her truck, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Miss Thompson? This is Margaret Green. Elijah was my father. We'd like to talk." Claire's knees nearly buckled. She leaned against the truck, eyes filling again. She typed slowly. "I would be honored." She hadn't even put the phone away when another message came in. This one from Jameson. "We're publishing tonight." Her heart thudded, and that night, just after sunset, the story broke. The headline stretched across the screen in bold letters. "Former deputy's secret journals reveal hidden civil rights hero." Within minutes, the article spread across the state. Shares, comments, calls, questions. Her phone lit up like a Christmas tree. Some messages were grateful, some curious, some were hateful. One from an unknown number simply read, "Lies. Stop dragging our town through the mud." She turned the phone face down. But then another message came. "We always knew Dalton hurt people. Your father was braver than he ever said." And another, "My grandma talked about Elijah disappearing. Thank you for giving her peace." And another, "Your dad saved my uncle. We always wondered what happened to the man who helped him." Claire sat on her bed, overwhelmed as tears streamed down her face. Grief, pride, confusion, relief all tangled together. For the first time in her life, she realized her father wasn't silent because he was cold. He was silent because he was trying to protect everyone he could. Claire looked out the bedroom window at the old barn, glowing faintly under the moonlight. "People are finally hearing you, Daddy," she whispered. "And I'm not done telling them." The next morning, the air in Magnolia County felt different. Not lighter, just louder. The kind of loud that didn't come from sound, but from attention, from whispers, from truths finally clawing their way out of the ground. Claire woke to the vibration of her phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. Notifications stacked so fast she couldn't read them. Her inbox overflowed with messages from numbers she didn't recognize. Some were quiet gratitude. Some were sharp enough to cut skin. "You're lying for attention. My granddaddy worked with Dalton. He wasn't no monster. Bless you. Elijah was my cousin. You should have left the past alone. My mama cried when she read what your father did." And then one that rattled her deepest. "You're not safe here anymore." Claire's jaw tightened. Fear crawled up her spine, but she pushed it down like her father used to push down the demons he never named. She sat on the edge of her bed, breathing slow, reminding herself that truth always woke up enemies. When she stepped outside, she immediately felt eyes on her. Mrs. Ellison from next door paused while watering her plants, staring with her lips pressed thin. Two teenage boys riding their bikes slowed down, whispering behind cupped hands. Cars passed slower than usual, drivers peering out like she'd suddenly grown horns. Claire walked toward the barn, each step carrying more weight than the last. Overnight, the barn had become a symbol, and symbols always stirred trouble. Sure enough, she saw the damage as soon as she reached it. Someone had thrown eggs at the side of the building. Yellow streaks dripped down the wood, and in the dirt, carved by a boot heel, were 3 words, "Liar's daughter." Her breath caught. She stood there staring at the insult for a long time, anger burning under her ribs. But she didn't let a tear fall. She grabbed a shovel from inside the barn and scraped away the dirt until the words disappeared. "If this is the price," she whispered into the quiet, "I can pay it." Inside the barn, sunlight filtered through cracks in the roof, landing in dusty beams across her father's journals, now lying open on the workbench where she had left them the night before. She touched the edge of one gently, like it was her father's hand. A car engine rumbled outside. She turned. A white sedan parked near the house. A woman stepped out, mid-50s, soft brown skin, eyes filled with something Claire couldn't name yet. She held a small envelope in her hand. "Miss Thompson?" the woman called gently, walking toward her. "I'm Margaret Green." Claire's throat tightened. Elijah's daughter. They stood facing each other, the distance between them heavy with decades of buried truth. Margaret's voice shook as she spoke. "My daddy, he used to tell us stories about a man who saved his life, a man he called the Quiet Angel." She paused. "He said he owed that man everything." Claire's breath hitched. He never told me." Margaret nodded softly. "Because he wanted to protect you, and my father wanted to protect him. They both carried the danger, so the next generation wouldn't have to." She opened the envelope. Inside was another photograph, older, worn around the edges. Claire held it with trembling fingers. It was her father and Elijah again, both older this time, standing outside a small church, hands clasped together in solidarity. On the back, written in Elijah's handwriting, "Forgiveness is freedom, 1998. Claire didn't even try to hide her tears. Margaret placed a hand on her arm. "Thank you for giving him his wings. People need to know what real courage looks like." Before Claire could answer, another car pulled up. Then another. Within minutes, the driveway filled with vehicles. Elders from the Black community, pastors, grandchildren of people who had lived through the same era, all stepping out quietly, holding flowers, candles, letters. They gathered around Claire like a protective circle. "We came to thank your daddy," an older man said, his voice raspy but strong. He wasn't the only white deputy back then, but he was the only one who said no. A woman added softly, "He saved my uncle's life. We just never knew his name." Claire's chest tightened, so painfully she thought she might break in half. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "He thought he was a coward." "No," Margaret said firmly. "He was a light. He just kept it under a bushel too long." As the group stood there, sharing stories of lives her father had touched, Claire felt warmth replace the cold knot in her stomach. But the warmth didn't last long. A pickup slowed near the driveway. Two men leaned out, faces twisted with bitterness. "Spreading lies about good men again?" one shouted. "Dalton was a hero," the other spat. Claire stiffened. Margaret stepped forward, unafraid. "A hero doesn't leave bodies unburied." The truck roared off, dust spiraling behind it. A hush fell over the crowd. Claire swallowed hard. "It's going to keep getting worse, isn't it?" Margaret squeezed her hand. "Before truth sets you free, it shakes everything that's holding it down." The group stayed with her until noon, offering comfort, prayers, and shared pain. When they finally left, the barn felt fuller than it had in decades, filled with stories, closure, and a truth no one can suppress again. Later that afternoon, Claire drove to the sheriff's office. Reporters swarmed the sidewalk, cameras flashing like lightning. Claire kept her chin up as she crossed through the crowd. She wasn't here for them. She was here for the truth. The sheriff himself, a tired-looking man in his 60s, stepped outside to meet her. He nodded respectfully. "Miss Thompson, we read the journals. We owe you and your father a great deal." Claire blinked, surprised. "You believe him?" The sheriff exhaled. "We've known for years Dalton had skeletons. But without evidence, our hands were tied." He gestured toward the building behind him. "We're opening a formal investigation. Cold cases, missing persons, all of it." Claire felt the weight on her shoulders shift. Not lighter, but shared. If you find the truth, she said softly, please let the families know. We will. As she walked back to her truck, a reporter shoved a microphone toward her. Miss Thompson, do you have anything to say about your father's involvement in the Dalton years? Claire paused. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, from his letters, his journals, his regrets. She looked straight into the camera. My father spent his life fixing things. Machines, fences, broken engines. But the bravest thing he ever did was fix his own soul. She took a breath. I'm just here to finish what he started. The crowd fell silent, and Claire drove home with a heart still aching, but no longer alone. For the next few weeks, Claire lived in a strange rhythm. One part grief, one part healing, and one part waiting for the next shoe to drop. The world around Magnolia County stirred with the kind of tension that only comes when long-buried truths are kicked to the surface. Some days, strangers she'd never met came to the farm just to stand near the barn, whisper a prayer, or leave a note of gratitude. Other days, she found anonymous letters in the mailbox, some kind, some cruel, some written by hands still chained to the past. One morning, while she was sipping coffee on the porch, a quiet knock sounded at the front door. She opened it to find a small, older woman standing there, soft brown skin, silver-streaked hair pulled neatly into a bun, and eyes touched by years of loss, but lit by something gentle. You must be Claire, the woman whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break something fragile in the air. Claire nodded, unsure. Can I help you? The woman stepped forward, holding a sealed envelope and a small wooden box. My name is Laverne Green, she said. Elijah's wife. Claire felt her throat tighten. She motioned her inside, offering tea even though her hands were trembling. Laverne accepted with a smile that felt like warm sunlight after days of rain. They sat at the table, the same table Claire once did homework on, while her father tinkered in the barn behind the window. Laverne looked around, taking everything in. He used to talk about this place, she murmured. Said it felt like the last safe spot he ever stood on. Claire swallowed hard. I didn't even know he'd been here. You wouldn't, Laverne said gently. Your daddy, he didn't want you touched by any of that pain. There it was again, that quiet shield her father had held up all his life, protecting her even from the things he couldn't protect himself from. Claire opened it slowly. Inside was a folded church program from 1985, a memorial service. She picked it up, confused. The name on the front read, In Loving Remembrance, Michael Rogers. Laverne's voice softened even more. Michael was Elijah's best friend. Dalton's men killed him during a raid. Your daddy? He was the one who buried Michael properly, gave him the dignity they'd tried to take. Claire's hand trembled as she traced the name. Why didn't anyone know? Because the truth was dangerous, Laverne said. But Elijah never forgot, and neither did we. She handed Claire the sealed envelope. He wrote this for you. Claire opened it carefully. Elijah's handwriting was bold and steady, the ink aged but strong. Claire, if you're reading this, it means William finally laid down the burden he carried for too long. He saved my life, but he saved my soul too. He taught me that a man can be born into a lie and still choose to live the truth. You should be proud of him, child, not for what he was, but for who he became. Claire felt tears falling before she even realized she was crying. The letter continued. I once told your daddy that truth breaks chains. He told me truth breaks hearts. We were both right. Take care of his story now. It's safe in your hands. By the time she reached the final line, Claire's breath was shaking so hard she had to grip the table to steady herself. Laverne reached over and held her hand gently. "You're not alone in this," she said softly. "There are so many people who owe your father their tomorrow." Claire nodded, unable to speak. They sat that way for a long moment, hands joined over decades of history. Neither woman had lived, but both were now responsible for carrying forward. When Laverne stood to leave, she touched Claire's cheek and said, "You're stronger than you think." And healing always begins with someone brave enough to remember. After she drove away, Claire walked into the barn. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the wood, wanding in thin golden lines across her father's tools. His journals, the empty space he once filled. She placed the wooden box on his workbench. For the first time, she noticed something she'd missed before. A small carving on the beam above the bench. 4 letters, cut deep into the wood with a steady hand. M.R. plus E.G. Michael Rogers and Elijah Green. Her father had carved their initials into the barn, marking the place where he had rebuilt engines and rebuilt lives, one small act of resistance at a time. Claire touched the carving with her fingertips. "Dad," she whispered, voice cracking, "you weren't a ghost. You were a guardian." The weight in her chest didn't vanish, but it settled into something she could carry, something she could honor, something she could finish. She stepped outside, breathing in the cool evening air. Fireflies blinked near the old fence. Somewhere in the distance, church bells echoed softly. Claire looked toward the horizon, the same place her father had stared at every morning, searching for peace he never fully found. But she would, and she knew exactly where to begin. The barn smelled different now, not of hay or rust or the dust of 50 forgotten years, but of something warmer, something lighter, something closer to peace. Claire stood inside with the doors wide open, letting the late evening sun spill across the floorboards. The light touched the places her father once walked, the tools he once polished, the corners where he'd laid down guilt he never told anyone he carried. It felt as if the barn itself exhaled after a lifetime of holding secrets. For weeks, she worked quietly, carefully, taking everything her father left behind and giving it a purpose he would have never dared to imagine. She cleaned the walls, sanded the beams, replaced broken boards. Locals, both black and white, stopped by to help, some bringing food, some bringing stories. Others brought nothing except the simple act of showing up. Every day, someone new came with a memory, someone he had helped, someone he had saved, someone who whispered, "I didn't know he was the one," as tears pooled in old eyes. She listened, she learned, she held their stories the way her father once held his, except she refused to bury them. By the end of the 3rd week, the barn had transformed. The old tractors were pushed to the side. The shelves were dusted and cleaned. Her father's journals sat under protective glass atop handcrafted wooden stands. Beside them lay photographs of Elijah, of Michael, of families her father had protected in silence. Newspaper clippings, maps, timelines, all placed with care. And above everything, carved on a restored wooden plaque, were the words Claire chose to define her father's legacy. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's facing what others refuse to. On opening day, people filled the yard before the sun even rose. Some came with flowers, some with candles, some with nothing more than heavy hearts hoping to be understood. Claire greeted each one with the same warm humility. she imagined her father once used when he offered help nobody saw. Inside, people walked slowly along the displays, touching the wooden beams like they were touching the past. They whispered prayers. They wiped tears. They nodded quietly at the journals, at the confession of a man who had sinned but refused to let those sins win. Two elderly black women held hands as they studied his handwriting. One whispered, "He was braver than any deputy back then." The other replied, "Bravery ain't just what you do, it's what you carry." Claire stepped outside for air, leaning against the railing of the porch her father once fixed every spring. She closed her eyes, letting the warm breeze press against her face. "Miss Thompson?" She opened her eyes to find Margaret Green standing there again, smiling softly. "You did good," Margaret said, nodding toward the barn. "Your daddy would have cried to see this." Claire let out a shaky breath. "I just hope I honored him." "You did more than that," Margaret said. "You freed him." Claire swallowed the lump rising in her throat. He spent his whole life trying to make things right. Margaret smiled, eyes glistening. Now the world finally knows he did. As Margaret rejoined the crowd, Claire remained on the porch alone. The sun was setting now, painting the sky with soft streaks of orange and pink, the kind her father used to watch from this exact spot after a long day's work. She sat on the porch swing, the wood creaking beneath her, just like it had when she was a girl. She ran her fingers across the rope knot he'd tied himself. Practical, unpolished, honest. "Dad," she whispered, voice trembling, "I finally see you." The swing swayed gently, as if answering. She looked out at the barn, glowing warm under the new lights she'd installed, filled with truth her father once feared would destroy her. But instead, it built her. Claire closed her eyes, hearing his voice in her memory, quiet, tired, full of regret and hope tangled together. "One day, you'll understand why I kept things locked away." She understood now, not because he was ashamed of who he had helped, but because he feared the world would punish her for his courage. Now she knew better. The world couldn't punish her for telling the truth. Not anymore. She stood up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, and whispered to the sky, "You fixed everything but yourself, so I fix the rest." A warm wind rushed across the porch, brushing her cheek gently, almost like a hand. Claire smiled through her tears. As the last of the visitors trickled out, she locked the barn door and looked at the sign she'd hung beside it. "The House of Repair, in honor of William Thompson, a man who restored more than machines." She touched the sign once, softly. Then she turned off the lights, walked toward the farmhouse, and felt, for the first time in a long time, light enough to breathe.